You're listening to 99.1 WQRT LP Indianapolis, and this is Create Here. Produced by artists and curators from Big Car Collaborative, Create Here is your place to listen to conversations with people making intriguing, innovative, and impactful things happen on the cultural front in Indianapolis, Indiana, and beyond. Find out more and access additional episodes at WQRT.org.
This is Shatay Marsh, and on this episode of Create Here, we're joined by textile artist Laura Foster Nicholson. Laura Foster Nicholson's artwork is in several museum collections, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the Denver Art Museum. With a BFA from Kansas City Art Institute and MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art, she has lectured, taught, and exhibited in the U.S., Canada, and Italy. She has been awarded an NEA Fellowship, 3 Illinois Arts Council Fellowships, and a grant from the Graham Foundation for Research in the Fine Arts. Most recently, she was awarded the Dehaan Artist of Distinction grant. This is Shatay Marsh, co-founder and director of programming and exhibitions at Big Car Collaborative, and today we're joined by Laura Foster Nicholson. Thank you, Laura, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This is a new experience for me.
Is this your first radio interview?
My first radio interview. Mm-hmm.
You're from New Harmony, you Indiana, and can you tell us a bit how important place is in your work?
Sure. Actually, to be exact, I'm from the Chicago area, born and raised on the lake, and small town, tiny town, and went off to go to art schools, Midwestern art schools. But this idea of place has been sort of in my work, I would say, since I started my graduate thesis in the early 80s. And I was searching for a way to use my textiles, my tapestries, to talk about things that had a sense of comfort, home, closeness, but were not figurative. And I was also looking at textiles as sort of a map for making my images make sense in the cloth I was making. So I seized on this kind of carpet, Persian garden carpets that came kind of from the middle 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and they were really grand carpets and always depicted formal gardens. So with the borders and the trees and everything, it was a very stylized version of an exterior space, but in a way without perspective, it was almost like a map on the floor of this garden. And I was really struck by that because in my earlier work, dealing with perspective on a textile was a losing proposition, I felt, in terms of my way of seeing the world. And so this sense of flattened planes became very important because I always wanted the fact that I was weaving a structure in cloth that was rectilinear, it was a grid, and rather than going off in abstract things, I was going to depict things about domesticity, homes, gardens, later other kinds of buildings. And it's almost like homemaking. You know, I'm a Cancer, and I'm a homebody, and I vastly prefer interior design to fashion design, for example. Go nuts over interior magazines and couldn't care less about what the Vogue says. So I've always stayed within that realm. And I lived in Chicago for much of my career, had an active exhibition schedule and so on, but decided at a point in the early 2000s that it was getting a little pricey, and we had children, we were getting a little restless, wanted something else, and somehow discovered New Harmony, Indiana. And we just started visiting it. My former husband and I, we visited it, and he was a professor of architecture, so he was all about place also. And one of the things that stuck with me that I was told in all of the lore about New Harmony was the fact that it's on ley lines. L-E-Y, lines, which are magnetic force fields, as I understand it, with some kind of a spiritual bent. And some people are very sensitive to that magnetism. And some people have no idea what we're talking about. Mostly the people who grew up there, they're just like, oh, here's another kook. So that's a long way around. When I studied at Cranbrook, my graduate school, it was also an intentional place, completely designed and built by the architect Elio Saarinen. His wife was a weaver and wove textiles for the buildings, and sculptors and other artisans made things for the campus and taught there. And so it was completely beautifully thought out 300 acres. Incredible. And that came back to me when I moved to New Harmony. So suddenly, or maybe slowly, my work has taken a big shift in the last 15 years.
Can you talk more about how these different places that you lived, influenced your work? Like going, you went from small town to Kansas City, then to, Cranbrook's right out, Detroit area, then to Chicago. What sort of, you also were thinking about places all over the world. Do you feel like thinking about these external places all over the world, connecting them to where you were and then weaving them together? Do you feel like that was part of the flow of it? And then, do you feel like each place you lived, did that get woven into it as well?
I'm sure it did. That's a really, really intuitive question that you've just posed. And often I don't know much about my work until I look back at it or until I have an exhibition, which is a great time to kind of stand back and go, oh, I must have meant that. Sometimes I'm just making things. I see things, I want to make them. I see things, I want to figure out how to make them in cloth. And, whatever is beating in your heart, whether you want to make a drawing of your best friend in high school or you want to make not an abstract, but an imaginary garden. They're all things that give my heart satisfaction to think about. But somehow when my mojo is working or the ley lines are working or something, I am able to conjure this work without having to think too hard about it. You go back and forth between the theoretical and the spiritual or the creative or something, and kind of try to make something that makes sense to you as well as to me. But what I've enjoyed about working with you, Shantae, is the way that every time we talk, you pose a question to me that I hadn't even thought of.
Oh.
That you've seen something in my work that I haven't seen, and you've given me a couple of fantastic ideas that inspired one or two of the things in the show here. And I think that the interaction between an artist and an eventual curator is so valuable, because not only I see my work through other people's eyes all the time, but a lot of it's limited. Oh, that's really beautiful. It's not very insightful. So when I can have talks with people who are educated in the arts and who are powered with deep vision themselves, it's really rewarding, and I learn new things about myself and my work, which is very important.
One thing I always pay attention to when it comes to artist work or why I want to work with them, which is why I wanted to work with you, is if a work, I feel a pull or a punch, I know that there's something more in the work, and I want to find out more about the artist and that piece. And that's how I feel about a lot of your works. And, this goes into a bit of, I'd like you to talk a bit more about, drawn a bit to these intentional communities, to New Harmony in particular, because of, almost its spirituality and that it, like the energy that it puts out compared to other places. It seems like throughout your career, you've gravitated towards these places. Even when you go to Cranbrook, the layout these things and the places, I believe, always have a huge effect and impact, especially on the work that artists make. Whether or not an artist can take that and transmute it into something that really affects people depends. And I feel like your work does that. But can you talk a bit about maybe, are you aware of the processes like externally influencing that and having what I think, I don't know how long you lived in Chicago.
A long time.
Yeah.
From 87 until 2006.
Okay.
As an adult. I mean, I lived there before.
What neighborhood did you live in?
We lived in an area called, very dully, North Center, which is about a half a mile west and a half mile north of Wrigley Field.
Okay. Was there something about that neighborhood or that place?
We could afford it. It was nice. We had a house with a huge yard, nice garden that we could make. And, I've always made my living as a studio artist. And for a studio artist and a, kind of an assistant professor, which was Ben's rank when we started, it was a little hard to come up with the scratch to buy a house in Chicago, but we did it. It was a great house. Raised our kids in the city, sent our kids to wacko schools because we could. And we had a sense of place in Chicago. I shouldn't talk in the plural all the time, but I'm thinking of my family. I had a very strong sense of place because of all the creative individuals and professional creatives that I knew there. And from the gallerists to my friends to, people I just saw on the walls of other galleries. It was really a very inspiring time for me and a way to, to work with people who would just find me and I'd just find people. And it was a real tight community in that sense for me, which was great. And I got a lot of work that way, commissions and so forth. So that meant a lot to me. I really feel I built my career in Chicago. I did a few things from other cities too, but Chicago was a very formative place. I don't know why we decided to move to New Harmony, except that we met Jane Owen. And, we'd been going there because we'd been tipped off about what an amazing place it is. And in fact, what I love about it is all the Harmonist remnants. There are not very many Harmonist buildings left, but the ones that are there are beautiful. And I managed to live in one now. It's very simple beauties. You think Shaker, and built 200 years ago and still strong. And this idea that it's located, number one, it's located on the biggest fault in the country. Screw the San Andreas. This place is, it's not a big fault. But the earthquake hasn't come yet. And it's got these ley lines. And so there's a sense, a lot of time of specialness. I don't know why. I just have a lot of fun there. I walk out on the street and talk to people or hide away in my studio and work for hours without talking to anybody. But it's a good place for that. It's nurturing. But, it doesn't have the depth and, I guess, professionalism of the Chicago art scene, of course. It's like, it's more like a retreat place.
Yeah. So Chicago was essential to you being able to work in New Harmony as an artist.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. What made you attracted as an artist to working in textiles and in fabric? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. I've been sewing since fifth grade or something. I really loved to sew and sewed and sewed and sewed. And my mother would scold me. My mother had gone to art school, and she had said, "You're using all your creative energy on sewing clothes. You've got to get back to your sketchbook." Really. But I loved fabric, and I loved sewing and constructing things. And so when I applied to art school, I had a portfolio, all my drawings from art class. I loved drawing. But when I had to declare major second year, I wanted to go into design and design flowery fabric. That's what I thought I was going to do, like what you're wearing, beautiful flowery fabrics. And I get into the design department and look around, and they said, "Oh, well, we'll be teaching you typography and all of this other layout stuff," and it had nothing to do with drawing for me. So I beetled out of there, thought, what am I going to do? And I went over to see the fiber department, which was really new. It was 2 or 3 years old, I think. And I walked around there, and it just felt right. So I was put off a little bit when my professor said, well, you will have to learn to weave. And I was like, oh, no, that looks scary. Those big looms, they look really scary. Well, as soon as I hit a loom, that was it. And I've always tried to... one of my mentors there was a painting professor, and he was always trying to make me take chances and think about the space and all that, which was fantastic. And I remember my sophomore year, I did a bunch of figurative tapestries and displayed them in the cafeteria. The department had a little show. And all the painting students I knew laughed at the figurative tapestries. They said, you should really just go to painting if that's what you want to do. So I thought, well, I guess I better find a subject that isn't figurative. And that's when I really started looking around. Yeah, gardens mostly and things. I took design classes in pattern design. I think that was the only thing that was of interest in design. But the idea of treating a textile as a space in itself was really, really formative to my thesis. My whole MO now, same thing. It has to make sense as a textile. You know, I still have painter friends, one of whom I could kill, and if he's listening to this, he'll know who I mean. He's a great artist, and he looked at some of my work in my show last year in New Harmony, and he said, gee, Laura, you could be a painter. Like that was a step above, like a grade above. I was like, I am going to pretend you didn't say that. But I'm not trying to do the same things a painter is trying to do. I'm making my own world in textile, and I love textiles.
There is a common, and I think it is less now. I feel like things have changed a bit in the art world, but, you know, used to fabric and textiles were looked, you know, seen as less superior, as more
Right.
craft. And but I'm sure like you did get the brunt of that belief going throughout probably a lot of your career. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. It's been interesting to, you know, fight my way through. When I first started at KCAI, well, in my second year, you know, when we got out of the foundations building, we had a very venerable ceramic department, and a very, very traditional potter was the head of the department, Ken Ferguson, really well known, really respected. But he really liked functional stuff, and he would come down and expect us to turn out rugs and blankets, and we weren't interested in that. They had just broken the barrier of fiber as art in the last, less than 10 years. It was really, really new to be considered as an art form, beyond the Bauhaus, you know, when they did so much with design and textile. So we weren't going to, you know, make blankets and rugs. Maybe we'd try them out just for fun, but really, no. We just wanted to make art, and it was really an exciting time. Luckily, my education was crafts-based. I mean, you can't make a textile unless you can make it well, right? You can't have it like in painting. You can't say what you want to say unless you've got good craft at it. But above that, I love making things with my hands, but it doesn't end at that, you know. I have to have ideas. I have to have it feed my imagination. I have to be able to feed my imagination and have it talk back to me. And there's a lot of prejudice against that. I have rarely exhibited in a gallery that was just for crafts. Now that's changing enough that I'm very, very pleased to be involved with a gallery up in Connecticut called Brown Grotta, and they strictly do textiles. And they're really at the top of the game. And you know, it's just really exciting to be showing with them. But they just have one show a year right now of gallery artists. And so I got one of the pieces that was going to be in this show went up there instead. And they're working hard on keeping it, although they show plenty of people who are well known for their basketry craft as well as art. You know, it's not a one-sided deal. It's been a fight. So most of the galleries I've worked with over the years would happily show my weaving, but they weren't just craft galleries. And that was kind of important to credibility in those days and to sales and keeping the price point up, which is pretty important. And so the first gallery I went with in Chicago, I was the only textile person she'd ever shown. and never did show again. And it went on down. I basically stayed with Chicago gallerists until I'd lived there long enough to have enough connections to just do all my own dealing. Still going to miss it, though, being with a gallerist. I think it's a challenge, but I also really insist that, this is my artwork. This isn't just a craft. If it was just a craft, I'd do a better job in finishing my edges and stuff. They would hang better. And I'll say one last thing. The Dehaan Artist of Distinction, the curator in New Harmony urged me to apply for that, and I'm like, there is no way anybody's going to give me this. And all of the questions on the application, which were like writing a MFA thesis all over again, were like, what makes your artwork distinctive, exemplary, original, groundbreaking? And I'm a weaver. And so I just had to fight that whole battle in that paper for them. And I said, this is important because I'm learning to continually teaching myself to use this woven surface as something that shows you exactly what I see. Things like that, and that's a hard job. Not everybody can do that. So it was nice to write that application and come to grips all over again with, my groundwork of building my work over the years.
I think the other thing is the ideas and process that goes into your work, just outside of the act of making the piece. You have several different series. Why don't you go ahead and talk about the one that you and I have together, Scenes from the Carbon Border. I don't know if you're calling that as that particular series, but that's our show together, is the Scenes from the Carbon Border. And then, some of the other different series is that, they start with a very strong concept.
Okay. What was nice, just to back up a little bit, is when you named the show, and at first I was like, huh? And I saw, you just kept refining that idea. I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, this applies to work I've done 10 years ago. And that was great because I had not made that connection. And curator's job, make those connections. And so then I brought up all this 10-year-old, 12-year-old work to add in with the brand new work of container ships. So that I've been really, 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 really concerned about climate change for a long time, as most of us have been. And a lot of my work is just intuitive. I just get attracted to the subject for who knows why, and eventually the story comes out. And when I first moved to Indiana, after living in a large city, in the city, drive back and forth, I-57 in Illinois, back and forth to Chicago, through fields and fields and fields and fields, industrial agriculture. It's kind of horrific, but it was also beautiful. And I made these tapestries of the shining silver grain bins and, the yellow grain and all that. And then I started creeping in, like, there was a place kind of 100 miles south of Chicago, near kind of culminating in Paxton, Illinois, where there's a huge wind farm. I think it goes all the way through to Route 41. I think that's the same wind farm. Anyway, it's enormous. And that is kind of thrilling when you're really worried about climate change and you're driving through industrialized agriculture fields to see these beautiful wind turbines sparkling in the sun and doing their work and all that. So I started sneaking those in. They're hard to weave, I can tell you. But so I did. But I started out just with the fields, then added the grain bins, and then the oil bins. I started noticing every farm has its oil pumps. I'm in a rural community. So those oil pumps that are like mosquitoes pumping up and down with the red heads, and the oil storage tanks, and all of that. I made tapestries of those. And then I started getting wise to what I was doing, and I added some fluorescent, I liked to think, kind of contaminated bugs in the sky. And that work didn't go over real well with my audience. I never actually had a full show of it. I think I might have showed it at St. Meinrad, but so nice now to finally like bring that work back out and pair it up with the latest work I'm doing. 2 years ago, I finally, when I was not long out of grad school, my former husband and a bunch of his architecture buddies were urged by their professor at Cranbrook to enter the Venice Biennale, because that year it was not going to be just that you have to be invited, it was going to be juried by Aldo Rossi, who I was just enamored of Aldo Rossi's work. And so the prospectus came, and I leafed through it, and I was like, I want to do this. There was a formal garden, a huge, beautiful villa and formal garden. And so I did this whole thing about I'd never been to Italy. This villa and the gardens, and 10 pieces, all different woven, and they all described this one place. And before that, I'd only done imaginary gardens. That was my first historical one. And so Venice became a very important thing to me, and we sent it off to the Biennale, and lo and behold, the Fiber Chick won one of the 10 big prizes. The architect guys were pretty jealous, I think, and if I say so. But that counted a lot for me. It got me published. It got me a lot of work. That was in 1985. And so I'm looking at online in 2019, I guess it was, and I was seeing all these articles about the flooding in Venice. And I knew Venice pretty well. I studied it hard, even though it was mostly online and in books. Once I got to Venice, I really looked hard at it. To see it totally knee-deep or waist-deep in water in these beautiful buildings that I'd studied so hard was staggeringly beautiful and heartbreaking, And so I just did a whole body of work about the floods in Venice. Showed that last year at the New Harmony Gallery, which I think is how you and I really got talking. And it was very gratifying. And that led in somehow, with the flooding and all, I thought I was going to start putting giant cruise ships in, because I was so aware and was reading more and more about it, about how the cruise ships are really wrecking the environment, not just in Venice, but certainly in Venice. And so I think they're so ugly, though, and I tried to imagine weaving one, and I just couldn't. So I'm looking through my pictures of ships, and I found my photographs I'd taken of container ships in the Seattle harbor. And I thought, now that would be fun to weave. And so off I went, kind of like weaving patchwork quilts. But then the more you do something, the more you realize the danger that it poses in our lives. And I put 2 of those pieces in the show in New Harmony last year. I was on to them. The show had been postponed for a year, so I was adding new work. And then suddenly that ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, and it became highly topical. So just like the floods were topical, now the Suez stuff. And so here I was suddenly reacting to the news. And that is kind of new for me, and yet with a very strong point of view. Mm-hmm. And that's been very, very wonderful for me, because I've often thought, I just make, these beautiful weavings of beautiful gardens, and they're all lovely, and I'm not addressing any of these real problems that we have in life. Well, I am now.
Real quick, I just want to add, the New Harmony Gallery Contemporary Art is the first contemporary art space in the state of Indiana.
It is?
Yeah, it was the first one. So it's a pretty important space, and the curator she's talking about there, and the partner that we have in the Social Alchemy Project is Iris Williamson. But I was able to visit your studio. It's just a beautiful studio, too. And being able to see all your work put together then, you also have a series that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, but with the facial expressions.
I just call them the faces.
The faces. I don't, I think that your work has always been, beautiful, but there's always been like an undercurrent there, broaching difficult subjects, and both personal and, just that everybody can identify with,
Yes.
So even outside, like, and I do, like, I think the environment, addressing the environment, started for you back in 85, with the series that you're talking about. But also, you were able to channel difficult events in your life into your work with the Faces series.
Yeah,
Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the Faces actually, I was kind of casting around for the next subject, and I'd finished up what I was doing the year before. I love to draw faces, and, so when I was told that even figurative tapestries wasn't really, avant-garde, I thought, every day, I have NPR on all day long, and that the couple of years that I wove those faces were in the thick of the Trump presidency, and oh my gosh, the number of faces that I felt myself making, or that I could imagine other people making during that time, not to get too political here, of course, but I loved the idea of trying in weaving to express the slightest variations in expression. To a smirk or a frustrated scowl or a howl or bewilderment or all of those things. I thought, how can I do that in this really simple method and get that across? And that was really fun. It was really fun to do. But I made a lot of small ones, and I've sold most of them now through a couple galleries. But I haven't exhibited the whole body. I've sent some off to shows here and there, but, so there they are. I mean, sometimes I wove a big body of work about, emotional pain when I went through a divorce, and sent it off to this great gallery I'd worked with in Santa Fe for years, and had a lot of success with them. And it was figurative work for the first time since that freshman experiencer. And the gallery politely asked me to leave after the show came down. I mean, that was it. They said, we don't really do work like this, we like your other work. Mm-hmm. And you can't imagine how often you get that line as an artist when I do bodies of work, but eventually I evolve. Isn't that what I'm supposed to do? So I thought they were beautiful pieces, and I still have a lot of them.
Yeah. The faces are the works that you made going through
the divorce.
The divorce.
Yeah, the faces aren't beautiful. They're funny.
Yeah.
But no, there were heads surrounded by bees. We'd been beekeeping, out in the edge of New Harmony, and it was, talk about a transformative experience. It was just beautiful to be surrounded by bees. I mean, I was in the netting, but, to have these wonderful creatures swarming around you. And I got stung here and there, but to have that intimacy with them was so thrilling. And I'd been putting bees in my work long before that, as an animator for these gardens or things. And so these works were full of bees, and they started out as harassed, just heads. They weren't faces or anything. They were just head and shoulders with the bees buzzing and obviously harassing. And ended up as tranquility with the figures in Savasana pose, full figure, surrounded by bees, and all at one with the world kind of thing. And that was a really wonderful way for me to express what I was going through. I've gone through, I've done a lot of different kinds of stuff, I guess. Yeah, you're a great translator for the human experience through your work, I think. Well, thank you.
Through these textiles, which is why I've been really attracted to the work. So you were married to an artist, a fellow artist, and you had a collaboration, and really that you both influenced each other's work.
Yes,
and then also you continue really to collaborate, right? Even
to a certain extent, yeah.
To a certain extent.
I still take my work to him for help when I'm stuck. He's the one I can, he knows my past, he knows all the work, and he was always an excellent teacher. Basically
bouncing ideas and like the push and pull between a partner you collaborate with, and, yet still maintain your own separateness as an artist.
Well, that was a very rewarding and sometimes frustrating experience. I mean, we spent 30 years together, and starting in grad school, He was made to be a teacher. I should just mention his name. He's named Ben Nicholson, and he's quite a remarkable brain, an incredible brain. And he inspired me a lot. He helped me see, like you do. He would look at my work and he'd see things, and I'd be like, oh, for gosh sakes. I love that other people find things in my work. I suppose it's true of other artists too. And he was very good at that, since he taught all day long, and the year he went on sabbatical. But we both had studios at home and children to raise, and I was in the attic and he was in one of the bedrooms, and sometimes it got pretty dense. We were both boiling over with ideas. I'd be full of my own thoughts, and suddenly he'd come bursting in with his thoughts, and it was just like a giant tidal wave coming in on what you're thinking about is suddenly these bigger ideas. His ideas always seemed bigger than mine. But it was wonderful. I do miss that, but luckily we both are in new harmony, and I have a certain amount of access to him for feedback. And we also still talk about our kids. So it's really valuable because I need eyes around me, don't you? I mean, you need feedback about what you're doing. I'm not making this I am making it for myself, but if I want other people to be able to make any kind of sense of it or draw any kind of emotion from it, I've got to know how people respond to it.
Yeah. Well, that also leads us into, how was it for you balancing motherhood with being an artist?
First child, they're 5 years apart. We put him in a infants and tiny children daycare when he was 6 months old in Houston. We just said it was just afternoons, 3 afternoons a week, so that I could get peace and quiet. But I remember when William was tiny and at home, on the days he wasn't at daycare, and he would just say to me, I'd be working. We were in an apartment. I'd be working in my loom, the corner of the living room, and he'd say, "Mama, will you be with me?" And that was the most heartbreaking thing. And I'd say, "Honey, I have to work right now." But we took some clay classes at this little street place and did some things like that. Both my kids could draw like anything, and deeply creative, both of them in different ways. And that was very gratifying. I know that I felt selfish sometimes by making sure they were taken care of so that I could get what I wanted to do done. I was not going to stop being an artist. I know other people whose wives were, as highly trained as they are, as deeply educated, who just gave up when the children appeared and never went back to it. And I'm like, why would you do that? This is my identity, is being an artist. Being a mother is part of my identity, too.
Yeah.
Now I don't get enough time with them. So now who's sad?
And so do you feel like it affected your work more than your husband at the time, your ex-husband's work? Being parenthood, basically, overall. Do you feel like he had those feelings of guilt at times, or did you talk about it as parents? Did he feel like at any point he'd need to give up his, or even think about that? No. Yeah.
No, he was very driven. We were both really driven, but he was super driven. And I suppose in order to keep up with him, I learned a much tougher work habit. I've sort of lost it over the years, but no, he was intensely ambitious. And it would be me who had to stop working rather than him.
Yeah.
Make dinner.
Yeah.
But he also taught, he had to leave the house and teach. Really rough schedule, 3 afternoons a week. Mm-hmm. Those were the days. But
so you have the Dehaan Artist of Distinction grant. What direction are you going to take your work now since receiving that grant?
Do you remember that talk we had in my studio? And you said, "Can you see yourself just surrounded by this?" Or something like that. It was almost like this tent-like idea. And I thought, that is cool. And I've been thinking about it ever since. The hardest thing for me is presenting the work. I never get it right. And I've done it the same way for years. It's like just hitting myself over the head over and over again. And so part of what I wrote in the Dehaan grant was a budget for developing a different hanging system that might involve things hung in arcs from the ceiling and things like that. And now, they're not listening, are they? Now that I've been approved for this, I'm terrified. I have to actually make it work. But there were a lot of things in there. There are career development things. Even at my age, I'm still working on keeping my career going. I need to update my website. I need to, what do I need to do? I want to travel and visit some galleries and strengthen relationships in the arts again. And all of that I have written into it also. So, and I did write, because I just felt I had to. There were all these ambitious ideas, but I wrote, I reserve the right to change my mind because I am a creative and intuitive person. And I might be saying this now, and I might go down a completely different path in the next year. But this is what I think right now.
You know, you're talking about, you said even at this stage, at my age, do you feel like there's ever a bias against being an older female artist, you know, in the art world?
I don't know if there is one or not, but what I feel is, I feel old-fashioned. I work in a really ancient medium with thread, and I do fairly, in one sense, very conventional pictures. You know, they're pictures. I make pictures still. Nobody's doing that. And, you know, the artwork that I see coming out with young artists is quite different from what I do. And the approach to textile is sort of anti-craft. And all of that makes me feel like I'm too old-fashioned. But it's what I want to do. It's what I know how to do. It gives me a great deal of pleasure and informs my soul, I suppose, to keep working like this. So I guess I'm not going to change.
I find your work very relevant and important. So I'm excited about our show together, Scenes from the Carbon Border. And I appreciate your time today, Laura, so much.
And yours, too. You know, I love spending time with you. We're going to have to do this more often.
Yeah, we will. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chate.